And I want you to keep the following in mind. Don't lose sight of the forest for the individual trees. The forest here is I'm going to look at the actual choices that people make, and I'm going to use other markets, which can be valued, to infer what the value is of the environmental resource. Okay? All right? Is that clear? Okay, good. Okay, travel cost methodology. Its widest use is to assess recreational resources. Why? Because these are resources that are actively used by people. Boating, swimming, fishing, whatever. Those are really activities that reveal choices that are being made. So you've got a basis for reveal preference. And moreover, the related markets are what is the opportunity cost of your time, which is going to turn out to be a function of what your compensation is for gainful employment, right? And the price for all of the goods that you must purchase to move from your residence to the recreational resource, namely the price of gasoline, the price of a rental car, whatever it happens to be. And it recognizes, this methodology also recognizes that if the cost of visiting a particular place is certainly higher than the cost of visiting some other place, then clearly the higher cost item is a preferred choice. And right away, you can, I hope all of you intuitively can see we're moving in the direction of getting a demand curve. We're going to end up trying to isolate a demand curve by looking at the number of visits, say, at a particular natural resource site, and the price that's going to be associated with that visit is the cost that you incur to access it. Okay? Yes?
So I keep keeping in mind like the idea of a survey, right, with travel costs, and by calculating travel costs, you're trying to calculate each person's willingness to pay, and eventually that's what
Yes, that's what's going to happen. That's what's going to happen. Right? And we're going to go through those steps right now. And the demand curve is going to be constructed, and we're going to interpret that demand curve, each point along that demand curve, as being the marginal willingness to pay for whatever consumer we're evaluating at that point on the demand curve. Now, what are the steps in carrying out the travel cost methodology? And this is described in your reading for today in some detail. You want to take the complete population of users, because we're only talking now about use of the resource, right? You take the entire population, you divide them into zones in which there's clear differentiation with regard to their travel cost. You can sample those visitors to determine which zones they come from, or as in the case of many national parks, you can ask them to fill out questionnaires to be able to impute what those travel costs are. Determine the total population in each zone. Determine the per capita visitation rate from each of those zones. By the way, you're never going to be asked a question on my exams about memorizing these steps, all right? I want you just to understand the implementation of the methodology, what you would have to go through to be able to effectively implement this, and we'll look at a specific example in a moment. Estimate the residents in the different zones if I want to get a total market-wide for the entire population value of a particular resource. And here's just giving an example. If somebody lives 50 miles away and we move the site 50 miles in addition, then we could look at some other potential user that's 100 miles away. And if we got that data, we can infer what the consequences would be of moving the site by 50 miles. Okay. And ultimately, the total visitation to the site is going to turn out to be a function of the distance from that site. Clearly, if the distance is much longer, and there are two major components of my travel cost, one is the cost of moving myself from my residence to the location of the natural resource, right? And the other is the opportunity cost of my time. And if it takes me 3 hours to get there versus a half an hour, certainly the site that's 3 hours away is going to be much more costly to me. Right? And that's fairly straightforward, right? And we're going to end up with the construction of a demand curve where the vertical axis is going to represent the dollars associated with a visit to use that resource, and the horizontal axis is going to be the number of visitations. Let's take a hypothetical example, and this hypothetical example is in your textbook. It's not based on any real-world data, but just to show how one would go about constructing this. In the first column, you have 6 different people. There's people 1, people 2, people 3, 4, 5, and 6. Okay? The cost that's incurred, this person has the lowest cost, and surprise, surprise, they make the most visits, which is the third column, right? And that is consistent if we go to the one with the highest cost, namely that would be this person. This person faces a cost of 6, and it only visited once. So right away we got a downward sloping demand curve, right? So it's consistent with the law of demand. Okay. Now, from this particular data, how would we go about constructing the demand curve or the willingness to pay? Take all of these data points, and all I've done, coming back to this particular table here, I've just taken this last column, which is the quantity, and that's going to appear across my horizontal axis, and this is the cost. Let's go to the graph and see if we can find person 1 with the 28 visits and the cost of 0.9, and that will be this point right here, right? So these are the actual observations for this hypothetical example, and now coming to regression analysis. Regression analysis is to find that line among those data points that minimizes the error sum of squares. I'm not going to hold you responsible for that. But that line that's drawn right here, is in effect taking and finding the relationship that actually summarizes those data points most efficiently. Right? Okay, let's look at a real example. And this is discussed in your reading for today. This is an instance in Buzzards Bay in southeastern Massachusetts where there was contamination that took place over the course of 30 years from some industrial activities, and the waste that was being generated by these industrial activities was PCBs that found their way into surface water, into the harbor, and detracted from that resource. Right? Okay. And that contamination resulted in the polluter, the parties responsible for that pollution, to come along and remediate the contamination and degradation that took place. And the basis for that kind of remediation we in this country have a number of legislations where the assigned authority for implementing that legislation at the federal level exists, at least at the federal level, exists with the Environmental Protection Agency. And the Environmental Protection Agency operates with a number of different underlying legislations. One is CERCLA, another is Superfund legislation. You all know about the spill in the Gulf of Mexico with regard to British Petroleum, right? British Petroleum, with regard to a class of fishermen and recreational users, just reached a settlement last Friday in which BP, British Petroleum, agreed to compensate all those fishermen and recreational users. I think the number was something like $7.6 billion. But there's more damage out there than just the harm that took place with regard to those users. Those were users of that resource, right, that were then prohibited from using the resource because of the contamination and the harm that was created as a result of the spill that took place. In addition to that harm, there's also the harm to the natural resource, namely what happened to various species of fish, what happened to birds, what happened to degradation of shoreline, all of those sorts of natural resource damages, and the underlying legislation to protect, quote, the public from such events is CERCLA. It's a Superfund site, Superfund legislation. And in each of those pieces of legislation, what EPA is assigned to do is to determine who are the responsible parties for the damage that took place. And in the case of the Gulf of Mexico, there's a debate that's going on between British Petroleum, Transocean, Halliburton about what is their respective responsibility, what's their shared liability for the harm and damage that took place. But what EPA is responsible for doing is identifying those responsible parties and then trying to fingerprint what the contribution is of each of those parties. One of the big problems with respect to this legislation is that sometimes companies are no longer around. They caused the harm and damage from 1940 to 1970, and suppose today, in the year 2012, they no longer exist. Or better yet, they've gone bankrupt in the meantime. Remember in 2008 when General Motors declared bankruptcy and got a bailout from the U.S. government? They closed down a number of sites and got the bankruptcy courts to eliminate their environmental liabilities for the harm that they had heard at those sites. Now the question, who's left holding the bag? Who stands in the shoes of General Motors and ends up taking the burden of whatever remediation of the harm that they may have caused over many years of production? Who? Yes, taxpayers. Exactly. Okay, but in any event, in this case, coming back to this concrete example, there was specific information with regard to the parties who were responsible for the contamination of this particular harbor, and that ended up leading to all sorts of litigation with respect to what is the total cost of remediation, and then what's the sharing among the four identified parties. Was it four or five? 5 companies. There were 5 companies that were identified, and this was some years ago, and it turned out that those 5 companies had to contribute $110 million to the remediation. And of that remediation, the amount attributed to beach recreation and fishing, which are users of the resource, those are users of the resource that we can use our revealed preference or travel cost methodology to estimate what their value is, and this is exactly what a particular study that was done at the time looking at Bedford Harbor and getting data on actual visitations and estimating the travel cost, and moreover, in doing this analysis, there was questionnaires that were set out to various users, recreational users, fishing users of this particular natural resource, and in the questionnaire, the researcher wanted to figure out what would be the willingness to pay if there was no contamination of the harbor versus what was the willingness to pay if there is contamination. Now, if I have those two measures, then it's a simple determination to get the change in consumer surplus for remediating the harbor. Right? Are you all with me? Remember the willingness to pay. The reason we look at the willingness to pay, we can compute from the willingness to pay or the demand curve, we can compute consumer surplus. And if I'm looking at the demand for the use of this resource, and in one state of the world it is a pristine resource, presumably that demand curve is going to exist everywhere to the right of the demand curve or the willingness to pay when there's contamination. Right? Okay, that's exactly what this particular researcher did. He came along and he went out and looked at the travel cost to a particular location within this harbor. It's called Fort Point, and he compared that to other options that users of this resource had. I mean, they could travel to Fort Point Beach, and this first column here is what travel costs they would incur by traveling to that beach. This is a number of trips that were made here, and if they chose not to go to Fort Point because it was a contaminated site, but instead went to the second nearest beach, this was their travel cost, and still another nearby beach, which was further away, this was its travel cost. Okay? And all of these travel costs include not only the physical expenditures of moving yourself from one location to another, but as well the opportunity cost of time. Okay, here's one of the actual users of this resource. Is a person by the name of Anne who lived 5 miles from the beach. And by the way, when I say the beach, I'm talking about Fort Point, where the actual contamination took place, right? Okay, she lives 5 miles from the beach, and what this researcher did is applied arithmetic. He basically came along and said, okay, at the time, what did I put up there? The year was 1986. It was a long time ago, where gasoline prices were a lot lower than they are today. It's 5 miles. The automobile cost was estimated at 42 cents. There was 15 minutes of travel time. Now, what is the opportunity cost of Anne with regard to that 15 minutes? Her wage rate after taxes is $8 per hour, because she obviously doesn't have to pay taxes to travel to this resource site, right? So you want to make an apples-to-apples comparison, so you take the after-tax rate. The cost to compute time, given that it's 15 minutes, that opportunity cost would turn out to be $2. Hence, the observation for Anne, and the point on the vertical axis for at least Anne is $2.42. Then the question is, how often did she visit? And if, whoops, I jumped ahead. And if I have the number of visits that she's made, I've got 1 point in the demand quantity space, right? If I know that her total travel cost is $2.42, and if she visited 7 times, then the 242 would be matched to 7 times. And I would do that, as he did, for each visitor in his sample to this particular site. And when he put this all into a black box, he estimated the following regression. This is a demand curve. The number of trips is equal to, that is just nothing more than our Q quantity demanded, number of trips. It's equal to some intercept term minus a coefficient on the price. And the price is the travel cost to Fort Point. And this is the coefficient on travel cost to the next nearest beach. And this is the coefficient here, 0.203, on the travel cost to the second nearest beach. Right? So that analysis ends up giving an initial demand curve. And now let's turn to what this particular researcher did to get a fix on the change in consumer surplus that would emerge if this particular beach had been remediated and or had never been contaminated. Okay, so what he did, he went out and surveyed these people to figure out how many trips they made, and moreover, did a second survey in which he asked these same people how many trips would they have made if there was no contamination in the harbor. So he's going to have the basis for estimating 2 different demand curves. Right? And that's exactly what he did. He took those 2 demand curves, which were from a sample of 495 selected people, and then he blew up that particular sample to the complete population, and he ended up with 2 different demand curves, which allowed him to compute the consumer surplus for a contaminated resource, another consumer surplus for a non-contaminated resource, and he did that for 495 people, but he wants to blow it up to the complete population, because he's only got a sample, right? So he takes that sample, and he first scales it down to the average consumer. He gets an average consumer surplus per person, and then he looks at the total number or population that might use this particular site in New Bedford, and then he gets an estimate of the total losses, where the losses are nothing more than the change in consumer surplus that emerged because of the contamination. So one way to think about it, the benchmark is what would be the total consumer surplus if there had been no contamination, okay, but for the contamination. Then he estimates the consumer surplus given the contamination. So now he can take the difference between those two and get the incremental value of a pristine resource or a non-contaminated resource. Okay? And that's just using the conventional microeconomic analysis with regard to demand curves and willingness to pay. It's just the route by which you get to those demand curves is much more complicated because you don't have prices. You don't have direct observations on prices in the marketplace as a result of the interaction between willing sellers and willing buyers. Okay? Now, the real strength of this methodology is that it is possible to get reliable estimates of the benefits to users. The weakness is that you can't use this methodology to infer what option value is, and you certainly can't use this methodology to determine non-use value. Those are the 2 limitations. Okay? All right. That's the first methodology. Let's go to the second methodology, hedonic pricing. Let me motivate it through a concrete example. Suppose, hypothetically, you're looking at an apartment house, and that apartment, the apartment that you're considering renting, is located, what's the most pristine location in the Bay Area? There's so many that come to mind, it's hard to recall one. What? Black Hawk? Black Hawk, are you serious? Is that the most pristine area in the Bay Area? Uh-huh. What about the people you have to live next to? I'm sorry, I'm just being silly. No, okay, let's take a place close by. Orinda, okay, you have a young family. You have children that are 7 and 8 years old, and you're looking at a rental in the city of Orinda that's next to their public schools. Versus you're looking at exactly the same amenities with regard to an apartment here in Berkeley next to the public schools in Berkeley. Everything else is exactly the same, all right? I mean, the same square footage, the same kitchen layout, the same lighting in the lodge. Everything's exactly the same, except one apartment house is located near a public school in Orinda, and another is located near a public school in Berkeley. What's going to be the difference in their value? What's it going to be driven by, first of all? No, I don't expect you to know what it is. Okay, Gabe?
Is this public school in Berkeley, or are we talking like another public school in Berkeley?
No, I'm talking about the public school in Berkeley. No, we're not talking about university. No, wait, this is K through 8. We're talking, I told you this family had 2 children, right? I did, okay, I did. Didn't I tell you the age? I did. See, you're not listening, Gabe. I told you the age. Okay, by the way, they're saying distance for their employment. Suppose they're source of, yeah, because I want to make everything else the same except for the public schools. Okay, so suppose they're working, what's the midway point between Orinda? Oh, they're working right up, yeah, no, right beyond the tunnel, a little bit beyond the tunnel. You're right, there's a company right there, and they have to go out, they're engineers, and they're writing software code, and they have to do it right at the tunnel, okay? Now, everything else is the same. Now, what is the difference in those 2 rentals going to be driven by? Pardon? Yes, precisely, the quality of schools. And it turns out that that's factually supported. Namely, it turns out the public schools in Orinda are dramatically better than public schools in Berkeley. Orders of magnitude better. And as a result, rental properties there are going to be significantly higher than rental properties here. And if you look at transactions on residential